Hey everyone, I'm Matt. I'm pastor at Journey Church, and I'm so glad to be with you as part of this series. And as we begin today, I got a question for you. What do you like to talk about? What do you like to talk about? Do you find yourself maybe just talking about maybe the game last night, or the weather, or the show you're binge watching? But that's kind of surface stuff. Like, what do you actually like to talk about? If you're hanging around with some of your close friends, or the neighbor you've known for a long time, or your office friends where you're like you always eat lunch with them or whatever, like, what do you like to talk about? For me, I like to talk about food. No surprise there, right? You probably tell by looking at me. But I love food. I love to cook food. I like to go out to eat. A lot of people ask me about restaurant recommendations or what they should get at a restaurant because they know I love food and I like to talk about food. One of the other things I like to talk about is the NBA. I love basketball. But you know what? I find a lot of people are willing to talk about food, but when it comes to basketball, like, they're just not that interested. I'll be like, hey, did you see the game last night? And they'll be like, no, I didn't. Or I'll be like, hey, what do you think about what? I don't really watch basketball. I don't really know. Or they may like, I like basketball, but I just don't pay much attention to it. And so I have a harder time. I have only a couple friends that they really like basketball like I do. And I have this one guy, I don't even talk to him that often. Our life doesn't cross paths as much as it used to. But I get like random texts from him and be like, hey, did you see that? And I'll be like, yeah. And so like when we're together, we always talk about basketball, and he's someone who understands it like I do. And so it's kind of fun to talk about that with him. But what do you like to talk about? That's the question. I'm going to just go out on a limb and say, you weren't thinking about, I love to talk to other people about God. Was that one of the things that you thought of? Maybe we're in church right now and you're thinking, I should have said that. That would have been the right answer to say. But you didn't have to share your answer out loud or anything like that. So you don't have to feel guilty if it wasn't or anything like that. And I'm guessing the reality is that that's probably not one of your favorite things to talk about, because talking about God can feel awkward. You can feel like I don't have all the answers, so I feel kind of ashamed. You can maybe have these feelings of, are they going to be mad at me? Is this going to go well? So I know when it comes to talking about God or sharing our faith, it can be challenging. It might feel a little bit more like talking about the NBA, like I was talking about earlier, where people just seem to maybe be disinterested, or they just don't know much about that. And so maybe the conversations don't go that well. Or maybe we just don't know what to say. But how do we share our faith? This is what we're talking about in this series, the ways to share our faith, to talk about God. And when it comes to that, I think we know the ways to not do it. Maybe we've had bad experiences with this in the past, of maybe someone yelling on the street corner, or maybe someone coming at it from a very judgmental approach, or maybe even someone just talking in big religious terms that people don't really understand. And so we kind of see some examples of how not to share our faith. But some other ways would be this too, of not talking about it, ignoring opportunities that we have, or being more worried about what someone would think about us opposed to their eternal salvation. Like, that's not good either. So we're called to share our faith and to talk about it. In fact, we see this in 1 Peter chapter 3. It says this. It says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Be prepared to give an answer. Now, I like this verse because it doesn't say be prepared to have all the answers. It doesn't say that at all. It says be prepared to give an answer for why you have this hope. What is your reason for having this hope in Jesus? And so you don't have to have all the answers, but we should be prepared to share why we have this hope. And it says do it with gentleness and respect. What I have found is that people are willing to talk about anything if we do it with gentleness and respect, whether that's God or something else. If we are willing to not be a jerk, not be judgmental, not be argumentative, if we're willing to listen to others, to respect them and their opinions, if we're willing to not be pushy or weird, but to do it with gentleness, that people are open to having a conversation. It might not be a long conversation. It might even be one where they just say, I'm disinterested, but at least they're open to hearing it for a moment. What if we could get to this point where sharing our faith wasn't something intimidating, where it wasn't something scary, where it was part of our normal conversation, where it didn't have to feel weird, we didn't have to worry about it, but it could be something that we could do just like we would talk about the weather or the game last night. I think we can get there. There are ways that we can share our faith that can seem natural and easy. We get some examples of this in the book of Acts chapter 8. We're going to look at a story about Philip who shared his faith, and it can give us maybe some ideas of how we can share our faith in a way that can seem normal and effective. Acts chapter 8, verse 26, we begin. It says this: Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, Go south to the road, the desert road, and go down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury. And this man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and he was on his way home, sitting in his chariot, reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, Go to the chariot and stand near it. So Philip ran up to the chariot, and he heard a man reading Isaiah the prophet. Do you understand what you're reading? Philip asked. Well, how can I? He said, unless someone explains it to me. So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. And in this passage of scripture, the eunuch was reading, He'll be led like a sheep to the slaughter, and a lamb before the shearer is silent. So he did not open his mouth. In his humility, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life will be taken from this earth. So that was the passage he was reading. Then it continues. It says, The eunuch asked Philip, Tell me, please, what is this prophet talking about? Himself or someone else? And then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. And as they traveled along the road, they came with some water, and the eunuch said, Look, here's some water. What is standing in the way of me being baptized? And he gave the order to stop the chariot, and both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. Now here we see a very interesting story about Philip, and there's a couple things I think we can take from this story and his experience that can maybe inspire us to maybe do something meaningful, like share our faith. Here we see in the story that Philip was able to give him the same hope that he's experienced. He shared this good news with Jesus, and this guy ended up wanting to be baptized. Man, he made a big impact on this guy's life, and there's no reason why you can't make a big impact on your friends' lives either. And so let's take some maybe ideas from Philip. The first thing is that Philip made himself available to do this. We see that God kind of spoke to him and led him, but he was available. Like, what if we were to make ourselves available to take this step to share our faith? Like, what if we were going to make ourselves available? For some of us, conversations like this aren't even on our radar. We're not even thinking about them. But what if we were to make ourselves available? How would we do that? That means we would be looking for opportunities, that we'd be listening to God's Spirit, that we would be maybe praying for opportunities. I believe this. If you would pray, God, give me an opportunity to talk to someone about my faith today. If you were to pray that consistently, that you'll begin to see those opportunities. And just like Philip, you might feel God leading you to share those and make a big difference in someone else's life, that they might find faith. So with Philip, it happened in the sense of God was speaking to him. It said the angel of the Lord said to Philip, and then it said his Spirit spoke to him. And I don't know if those were audible words or not. I know, like, for me, my experience with feeling God leading me to do something, it usually isn't an audible word. It's maybe just some words in my mind. It might be kind of a nudge that we might feel like, in a sense of, you should take this step, or just this sense that you just kind of feel. And so I think too, if we're looking for those opportunities, if we make ourselves available, if we're praying about that you could maybe have that same experience where God points someone in your direction and you have the opportunity to speak life into that relationship and to share just like Philip did. but we have to make ourselves available to do that. One of the things that I used to do before I worked at a church, when I had other jobs, is I would read my Bible on my lunch break. There was this one job where we had like a kind of our break room area was just kind of the back of the shop, so it wasn't closed off or anything. You were just kind of still in the shop, and there'd be sometimes be people working around you, and a lot of times you took your lunch break on shifts, and so sometimes you'd be by yourself, or someone would come in kind of halfway through your lunch break or things like that. And so, like, if I was by myself, I'd be reading my Bible, and sometimes people would come in and sit down next to me and start eating their lunch. And I just remember this one time, this guy was like, "What are you reading?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm reading my Bible." And this led to this conversation, and he was just saying, like, "Yeah, I don't think I could ever go to church. I've done too much, and I'm sure God is so mad at me." And just being able to share with him, like, there's always a second chance with God, that God loves you unconditionally. And like, the conversation didn't go a lot past that because he didn't really want it to. And I've had other opportunities when I was working there to talk with him about it, and I can't say that I was able to baptize him or anything like that like Philip did, but I know I was able to share my faith with him, plant some of those seeds, and who knows what God will do with that. So would you make yourself available like Philip did? That's one way. The other thing we see from Philip in here is that he shared with him the good news about Jesus. He was asking about this obscure passage in Isaiah, and Philip was able to point him towards Jesus as it was talking about him. But I think for our experience like this too is oftentimes we feel like I don't have all the answers. And again, that brings us back to where we began with that 1 Peter chapter 3. It talks about giving a reason for your hope. To be prepared to give an answer, not be prepared to have all the answers. Like, we're not going to have all the answers. But what we can do is point people towards Jesus, just like Philip did with the eunuch. You know, people might ask you an obscure religious question. Well, what about this in the Bible? Or I heard someone say this one time, and there's no reason why you can't say, well, you know, I don't know about that, or I'm not sure about that, but here's one thing I do know, and point them towards Jesus. So how do we talk about Jesus? How do we point people towards Jesus? How do we give a reason? How are we prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have? And again, we don't have to have all the answers, but what if we just had a few thoughts that could help guide us in these conversations that we want to have in order to share our faith? I think if you answered these two questions, what do I know, or what have I learned about God? And then, what have I seen or experienced? Like, what do I know or learned about God? What have I seen or experienced? If you were just willing to think through those ahead of time, so you are prepared, like that verse said in 1 Peter. If you were to think through those ahead of time and have a few thoughts or a few sentences written out so we can prepare ourselves, I think that could come a long way and allowing us to be in a conversation where talking about God doesn't feel weird, where it can be a normal part of our conversation. Like, maybe just think about this. Like, what do you know about God? Maybe something that is really important or dear to you. Maybe it's something like that God is merciful, like he forgives us. He always gives us second chances. Or maybe it's the love of Jesus is unconditional. It's for anyone and everyone. Or maybe it's something like God promises to be our peace and our hope in the middle of the struggle and hard situations. Maybe those are some things that are near and dear to your heart. And those are things that we could say, if someone says, well, what about this? And they might have some obscure thing that they ask a question about when it comes to church or God, you can say, I'm not so sure about this, but here's one thing I do know, is that God's love for me is unconditional, and he's forgiven me, and I can have hope. And just leave it at that. Again, we don't have to share everything we know. We don't have to have all of the answers. It's just giving a reason for why we have the hope that we have. Maybe another example of what have you seen or experienced? And maybe for you, it's maybe what you've experienced is God is in the middle of stress, he brings you peace. Or maybe it's he's helped maybe guide you as a parent. Or maybe he's helped restore your marriage. Or maybe some other experience. Like, what have you experienced? What have you seen? Or how has God changed your life? Like, how could you talk about that with someone? I think this is a great way to work this into conversations where it doesn't feel weird. It can just be a normal part. Someone might be talking to you about being stressed out or just feeling anxious about things, and you could say to them, like, one of the things that I do when I feel anxious is I pray and I just ask God to be my peace. Or you could say, here's this verse, and I read this verse as a reminder that God's with me through the struggle. Again, you don't have to have a long conversation about it. You don't have to expound upon it if you don't want to, or if they don't want you to, but it's just a way to talk about God and to share your faith in normal conversation. You could even say something like, I know maybe you've never heard this before, or you might think this is a little weird, but one of the things I do is I pray or I read this Bible verse. You can even say that, and it helps break down some of the walls by saying, like, this might be a little different. Or maybe it's like someone's talking about their kids and feeling like their kids are just going in the wrong direction, or they're just kind of worried about their kids. And maybe one thing you could say is, I definitely get that. And one of the things that's helped me as a parent is I use these resources we have at church to have meaningful conversations with my kids. And it gives you these prompts to do at like bedtime or bath time or dinner time. And it allows me to have these meaningful conversations about important stuff, about like kindness, and it's helped me kind of guide my kids in the right direction. Or maybe someone's talking about struggles in their marriage or complaining about their spouse, and maybe you could say something like, one thing that I've done is that I began to pray with my spouse. And it feels like it's brought us closer together, because every night before we go to bed, we just pray for each other, and it just feels like we each have our best in mind for the other person, and it's really helped our marriage. Again, I don't know what you've seen or experienced or what is important for you, but maybe just taking a little bit to think through that and to answer that question. Because if we're willing to answer those two questions, that can help us be prepared to give a reason for why we have the hope that we do with Jesus. It can help us talk about it with others and to share our faith in a way where it doesn't seem weird or pushy, where it's just part of normal conversation. And again, you don't have to have all the answers. It's just pointing people towards Jesus. It's a great place to begin. So what about you? What I'd like you to do right now is to take a minute and maybe pull out your phone and pull out the Notes app, or pull out a piece of paper and maybe just start to brainstorm a couple thoughts along those two questions. What have you seen or experienced? What do you know about God? Or what have you learned? What is dear to you about God? Just write down a few thoughts about that right now. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to do that.